luck reduces the returns from skill, which means that your players have to play more games to figure out who's the best player, which means players are playing the game more.
Distraction makers.
So something that we hear often in the comments or otherwise is that
we should play Flesh and Blood.
We should play Flesh and Blood. No, it's that luck and skill are opposing forces. In that if a game is has a lot of luck to it, then it is not a skillful game.
Yeah, and in fact, there's plenty of people that have commented saying they don't like playing games with luck.
Yeah.
In general.
Yeah.
And then they'll name a game that usually has some luck to it.
So this is I think maybe Richard Garfield's career thesis.
Oh God, it's his bread and butter. It's literally for I think maybe 20 years now he's been giving this talk on luck versus skill.
Yeah, so we're gonna sum up.
We're gonna steal it.
But
we're gonna steal pretty much everything he's gonna talk about.
But we're also gonna add in our own sort of analysis in terms of why players have this kind of resistance to games that have a lot of luck in them.
Yeah, because I think that a lot of what Richard has explored, and I think that now has sort of been taken up by other designers, is a lot of the probability and the success of using luck to increase the longevity of your game,
right.
And the breadth of your player base. But there's all sorts of other aspects, and emotional impact is definitely a big part of it. Before we talk about luck versus skill today, please, if you like the videos on our channel, give us a little like, a little subscribe.
Also, today's video is brought to you by
my Kickstarter that's coming out later in August for the 5-color playmat series that I've been working on. This is the blue playmat.
Woo!
Woo.
Links in the description. You can sign up to be notified when the Kickstarter goes live. So let's start with a sort of explaining Richard Garfield's take, his thesis on how luck and skill are not dynamically opposing forces, but that luck just reduces the returns that you get from skill.
Yeah.
His example that he uses all the time is something he calls rando chess, which is basically you play a normal game of chess, and then after the game is over, you roll a d6, and on a 6, the person who lost the game of chess wins. And on 1 through 5, the person who won the game wins.
Yes.
And obviously, he says this is not...
It's not a good game.
It's not a good game.
He calls these toy games, which is a great design tool to try and utilize.
I think so. I don't know if I'm on board with calling them toy games, but toy sounds too fun because that game does not sound fun at all. So the point being, though, is that you can add this sort of level of noise to the sort of data collection that is playing repeated attempts of a game, and you'll still end up with all of the best players in the world still being the best players.
Yeah.
It just takes more games. You have to play more games to get to that sort of solved metagame state.
Right. Whatever that general average of success rate is, it's going to be higher for the better players still.
What this doesn't account for is the emotional element, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit later. But in terms of being mathematically sound, this makes perfect sense, right? It's that if instead of saying we're going to play a game of chess and then roll a d6, instead you sort of incorporate that die roll into the structures of the game itself, you're going to end up with a game that needs to be played more times to get to the conclusion. And he talks about sort of games can be high luck and high skill and still be extremely rewarding. Poker is a great example where, he sort of presents things on a quadrant where you have high skill, high luck, low luck, where something that is high skill, low luck is chess, high skill, high luck is poker, low skill, low luck is tic-tac-toe, and then low skill, high luck is Chutes and Ladders or something. Whatever, something that's just all...
Something that has zero skill.
There's not really
any
decision making, right? And I think maybe we need to clarify what skill means in these instances, and I think it is a sort of meaningful, impactful decisions that change the outcome of the game.
Right. It's whatever the game interaction is that moves you towards the win condition and what that ends up being.
And if you can make sort of tactical decisions about that,
right,
that might get interrupted by the luck, the variance, but the skill still matters.
Yeah.
Where in something like tic-tac-toe, there's a foo strategy that emerges very quickly in that, I guess, sort of always results in a cat's game or whatever. There's always a draw.
Yeah.
Or if the other person doesn't, asymmetry of knowledge, the person who doesn't know that just always loses.
Right. But the branch of knowledge of decisions is much shorter and
there's just
many people will solve it. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that sort of sums up the general thoughts from sort of Richard Garfield's presentation. We'll have a link in the description, so you check out the full video if you want. One of the other things that he talks about this in characteristics of games is that part of the reason why you want a level of sort of noise in the data collection of the matches played in your game and getting to the sort of solved state of who's the best player.
Yeah.
The reason why you want that is because, again, you want people to have to play a lot of games to get to that point. But there's another reason here, which is you want players to have more meaningful games against people who are higher skill levels than them.
Yeah.
And he discusses this in terms of having sort of different buckets for each of your players in, to put your players in. And each bucket previous to it should have like I forget, it's like a 20% chance of beating the bucket.
That's, I think, what he ends up bringing it down to is that, they ended up aiming for like 15-20% or something like that. And some games might have a 40 to 60% bucket. It just depends on their level of like consistency.
Oh, right. And it's not that like the best player at your game or the worst player at your game should have a 20% chance to beat the best player at your game.
Right.
That's too many buckets apart. We're talking about like someone who's like at the worst, like beginning skill level of the game, being able to have a meaningful game against someone who has at the next skill bucket ahead of them. And this might be presented as, I don't know, somebody who just picked up a pre-con and someone who has played the game for 6 months, right? I don't know. I'm not exactly sure where you draw the lines on these buckets, but that's sort of the idea.
I think one of the biggest ways that we end up seeing the sort of emotional resonance or impact of luck in games is almost always when someone ends up finishing a game that they lost and they went, oh man, I got so unlucky.
Sure.
Like, if I just drawn this card or if I just done this or whatever. And Mark Rosewater's talked about this too, but I think what's interesting is like a lot of the time it masks what that person was missing the whole time. And that's something that luck can do to affect someone's psychological standpoint on like what they imagine the game to be. Whereas a lot of the times I feel like in chess, you don't have that decision making of like luck. Like you could still be like, if I'd only done this or that or whatever, but it's not because you misdrew, right? Or someone else drew lucky or something.
Right. There's no release valve in terms of your abilities as a player of the game, right? And that's one thing. I think this is a good psychological impact on players, is that when they have something to point to that's like, I lost it because I got unlucky, that's different than I lost it because I'm not good enough at the game. And this is actually something really early on that you start learning as you move into competitive Magic, is that you need to stop looking at it as though you got unlucky and start thinking about the decisions that you actually made that led to that outcome. One of the most famous being if you're playing like an aggressive deck and your opponent is at 1 health and you lost the game, more often than not, you could have made a different decision elsewhere in the game that would have gotten you that single point of damage.
Now, that being said, it's not like there aren't moments even at the top end where someone gets lucky or unlucky. Yeah. At the very top end, a lot of the times it is down to luck. I think the famous game with Luis Scott Vargas, yes, where he had to mulligan down to 4 cards, I think.
Yeah, okay, so that's actually a really interesting example because I think Magic overcorrected, and Luis even in that moment has come out and said, I don't know if you needed to change the mulligan rules because of this.
Do you want to explain what happened?
So what happened was we're in the Pro Tour Finals match, last game of the series, and Luis Scott Vargas ends up having to mulligan down to like 4 cards or something, and it's still like a bad 4 cards, and he ends up just losing the Pro Tour or whatever, because of the variance.
Yeah.
And I think that is sort of like the absolute worst case scenario in terms of game states that this variance can make.
Yeah.
However, I think that using sort of a singular game as like a singular data point as like, hey, this is not okay. And like, I get it. I can understand the sort of response of, well, we want to make sure that exact scenario doesn't happen again.
The big problem is if this is the finals, the big exciting finals at this tournament, and it's just like
a non-game.
It's just a non-game. Yeah, it's not exciting.
It's very anticlimactic.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah, I get that from a like storytelling perspective, that when you get to the end of this tournament and it's lost due to, literally a coin flip.
Yeah.
That's a problem. However, I think that again, when you start to sort of remove and hedge against these things and make it so that like a game is more consistent, you start to push those skilled players further away from the casual players.
Yeah.
And, we can look at it in terms of like, casual and competitive are almost are getting even more separated now because of Commander. They're not even playing the same game anymore, really.
Yeah.
And I think what ends up happening is it starts to lead to sort of this path of unsustainability where the chasm between being a casual player and being a competitive player is so vast now that you really have to want to get there.
Yeah.
You really have to want it. And if there isn't really any kind of incentive to want it, then nobody cares.
I mean, there's still going to be some people that care, but it's going to be much smaller.
A very small number of people.
Yeah. And I mean, you end up getting that where I feel like you end up having some of these games that they lean into the consistency a lot more, and they're like, oh, well, we want a more competitive game. We want this really competitively viable game for people to play. The problem is that, like, the casual players are the people that keep the lights on for the most part.
Sure.
They are the ones that are coming in. They might be tourists of the product. They might stick around and invest every now and then, but a large portion of player bases are usually casual players.
Yeah, it's like 10% has ever played in any kind of a tournament.
And when the majority of what is making your game interesting is a competitive state, then you are alienating a lot of those casual players.
Sure. I don't know. I'm kind of curious about if there's a way, like if the sort of like previous funnel of Magic made sense in terms of, all right, well, we're designing for the best play state at the highest level that we can, and then we're sort of letting other things trickle through to the casual audience. If that results just in like you're sort of leading from the front, right? I think that's part of what used to happen in Magic is you make sure that at the highest level, if players are playing as optimally as possible, the game is still a lot of fun. And then let the sort of casual audience get to any percentage of that they decide to get to. And then that way you at least know, you can look at it and say, I know that if there are players who follow the optimization all the way through, they try to optimize the fun out of the game's still good. The game's still fun.
Okay.
Where if you're designing for just like, okay, well, we're gonna design for the masses or whatever, we're gonna design for the huge percentage of casual audience, and then we're gonna say, well, most players aren't getting to that top end anyway, so who cares if the top end is kind of you know.
I think it's I mean, it depends on the game, right? It's like you wouldn't design a game like Munchkin with the intent of like caring necessarily about top end Munchkin players, right?
Sure.
Not only because it would just be a massive nightmare to try and create a competitive format of that, but because it generally doesn't suit that type of play style, and it's not something that they'd worry about. However, I think that in a game that looking at Magic, it's a 1v1 format. A lot of the times 1v1 games are primarily exciting because you are competing against that other person and you are battling them. And so having any sort of a battle of wits or skills in a game that wants to be tested, like you're going to make sure that that's tested to people that take it very, very, very seriously. In fact, I feel like it's hard to find games that don't, in a 1v1 state at least, that don't try to take the competitive part very seriously, and like you said, trickle down to the masses. I think the closest would be maybe like Pokemon.
Well, there's a whole nother conversation to be had there about how they're able to continue to sort of power creep the game and have it not destroy the game, but that's the set point conversation we have later. But so when you think about introducing variance into your game and thinking about like how it affects players' emotional states, the sort of baseline way to talk about this is probably input versus output randomness, where input randomness is happening before critical decisions are made and output randomness is happening after a critical decision is made. So this would be the easiest example is Magic versus D&D, right? Where in Magic you're going to draw your hand of cards, and then when you go to play that card, like Lightning Bolt, it's going to deal 3 damage. It's not going to deal 1d6 damage. Where you look at D&D, and you're moving that to output randomness, and that turns in that's more, all right, I roll to I have decided to attack this thing. Let me see if I actually hit it. And both of these are valid. Both of these are useful tools in creating some kind of experience, but you need to think about the emotional state that you want your player to be in. And if you're saying, all right, well, I want my player to feel like they have agency over the situation entirely, then it needs to be focused primarily on input randomness, where the randomness is happening before those critical decision points. Where if you're looking at something that should be more casual, right, you're probably looking more towards output randomness or something that is creating a dynamic narrative. That's why it makes sense for D&D.
What I'm trying to figure out is like trying to decide what type of variance ends up sort of leaning in the direction of skill. And like you're saying, output tends to lean towards more of a casual crowd.
Yeah.
Reason being, in general. It doesn't mean that that's always the case. I mean, is there competitive Warhammer?
Yeah.
Okay. And Warhammer relies...
I should say yes, but it's not taken as seriously as competitive Magic.
Okay.
Like, there is competitive Warhammer, but it's not... I think players mostly know that, like, this is, like, there's even, like, okay, we're going to measure line of sight. Yeah. There's a lot of rulings decided between the two players playing the game rather than a judge third party coming in. Gotcha. There's some judge stuff, but, like, there's a lot of fudging. Okay. Like, yeah, okay, sure, okay, I could see that.
But that game primarily relies on output randomness. Now, it's very consistent how you end up constructing your army and how you're able to just use your army.
It's on the table
right away.
Yeah.
But in order to make up for that, they have variance in order to account for that. But it's output instead. Yeah. Whereas you could look at a game like Duelist, which has a board, army, minions, and stuff like that, but they don't allow you to place all of them right away.
So I think that when we look at like luck versus skill, it doesn't really matter mathematically whether that variance happens as input or output randomness. But psychologically, a player is affected much more by output randomness than input randomness.
Yeah, in fact, you get a lot of people that end up saying that they dislike output randomness because of this. Ironically, they'll still probably play Warhammer, but they still, there's a lot of people that don't like output randomness, but I think what it is that usually it's some sort of a combination of effects. I tend to personally think that the type of randomness that people accept is one that is best associated with the story being told.
Sure.
If the story being told makes sense for the type of randomness that is happening in the game, players just sort of accept it.
And I think an interesting comparison here is something like if we look at XCOM versus like a first-person shooter, where XCOM, a tactical squad-based shooter, where turn-based, where you have a percentage chance to hit something. Like most famously, the players are frustrated with the fact that like it said I had a 95% chance to hit and I missed. But I think part of the issue here is like this output randomness of I have a 95% chance to hit this target and I miss versus a first-person shooter still has output randomness. It's just that it's perceived as it's your skill in terms of like, all right, well, I'm lining up my shot and I take the shot and that person moves and I miss. That is still the variance, right? They could have moved one direction to the other, but you happen to not line up your shot.
Yeah.
But it's perceived as you missed, not they moved.
Right.
Right. All right. So I think in terms of something that designers can take away from this talk, we can actually look to Team Fortress for a minute, because when Team Fortress first came out, they had critical hits, and eventually they removed them from the game. So when you're first designing a game, it'll end up having it should anyway have almost the most variance that players will accept at that point in time, because you're not going to be able to add more to it as time goes on. As players become more skilled in your game, they're much more likely to accept additional variance that's added to the game. So at baseline, when you're sort of designing your systems, look for being able to add noise to that data collection as early as possible in terms of adding some amount of variance to the game. Input randomness and output randomness are both different tools for evoking different feelings in players. But if your game is competitive-minded, input randomness most of the time is going to be seen as more acceptable than output.
Yeah.
So,
but it depends.
It does depend. It depends on the story you're trying to tell. Also, luck and randomness are not opposing forces. Yeah. It's just that luck reduces the returns from skill, which means that your players have to play more games to figure out who's the best player, which means players are playing the game more, which is great.
It takes them longer to find out what the meta is, which makes sure that it takes longer for them to fall off, giving you more time to develop more content for the game,
Yep.
for you to come out and bring those players back in.